It did not arrive like a warning. There were no sirens, no breaking headlines, no single moment anyone could later point to and say, "This is when it began." What Alois Irlmaier described always came quietly, like a pressure change before a storm, like the weight in the air before something gives way. Irlmaier was not born into power, scholarship, or prophecy. He spent most of his life digging wells in small Bavarian villages, working the soil, listening more than he spoke. People passed him every day without noticing, and for most of his life, that was exactly how he wanted it. But after a near-death experience during the chaos of the First World War, something followed him back. Not beliefs, not ideas, images. They came uninvited, sharp, complete, scenes that did not behave like dreams. He would later say they appeared before his eyes, as if he was standing inside them, watching events unfold long before they happened. He did not search for meaning in them. He did not interpret them. He simply described what he saw, often reluctantly, often with visible discomfort. And that reluctance became part of why people listened. When Germany lay in ruins, he spoke of rebuilding. When Europe believed peace was permanent, he spoke of new conflicts rising. He described technologies that did not yet exist, moving images carried through the air, objects watching from above, tales that sounded absurd at the time, then unsettling later. Over decades, the accuracy of certain visions turned laughter into unease. But even as people began to take him seriously, Irlmaier insisted on one thing: the most dangerous events were still ahead, not because they would be violent, but because they would feel normal. He spoke of a future collapse that would not begin with invasion or bombs, but with confusion. A society that still functioned on the surface markets opening, governments speaking, people going to work while something essential quietly eroded underneath. He described this erosion not in economic terms, but in human ones. Trust thinning, truth blurring, neighbors no longer recognizing one another as the same kind of people. In his visions, the world did not fall forward, it sank inward. When he spoke of America, his tone changed. Europe, he said, would feel the tremors first, but the center of gravity would shift across the ocean. He described a nation once admired for clarity and direction becoming internally exhausted, not defeated by enemies, but worn down by itself. A place where information multiplied but understanding disappeared, where every voice grew louder and meaning grew thinner. What made these descriptions unsettling was not how dramatic they were, but how ordinary they sounded. Fires in streets, arguments in homes, institutions still standing, but no longer trusted, news that confused instead of informed. A population divided not by borders, but by perception, people inhabiting the same land while living in entirely different realities. Irlmaier never spoke in the language of parties or policies. He did not name movements. He described atmospheres, emotional climates, the feeling of walking through a country where nothing has officially collapsed, yet nothing feels solid anymore. He warned that this phase would be the most dangerous precisely because it would not feel like danger. It would feel like fatigue. And from that fatigue, he said, a figure would rise. Not a savior in the traditional sense. Not a tyrant in the obvious one. A symbol. A man whose voice would cut through confusion because it was simple, loud, certain. A man admired by millions and despised by millions more. Someone who spoke as though he alone could restore what felt lost. In the vision, this figure did not create the division, but he embodied it. He became the mirror through which a fractured society saw itself. Years later, many would associate this description with Donald Trump. Not because Irlmaier named him, he never did, but because of the role he seemed to play. a leader who arrived during chaos, governed through crisis, and left behind a nation more emotionally divided than before. But the prophecy was never interested in his rise. That part, Irlmaier suggested, was inevitable. What mattered was what followed. He warned that this figure would not fall in the way history expects powerful men to fall. Not through ballots, not through coups, not through assassination or war. The collapse would be quieter, more personal. A dismantling that began from within, carried out not by enemies shouting from the outside, but by allies stepping back at exactly the wrong moment. In the vision, the crowd remained. The noise did not stop. Supporters still gathered. Opponents still shouted. But something subtle vanished. Protection, the invisible structure that power relies on when things begin to go wrong. Advisors hesitated. Loyal voices softened. Doors that once opened automatically began to close more slowly. This was not a single betrayal. It was a thinning. Irlmaier described a moment with unsettling clarity, the realization that applause does not equal safety, that admiration does not guarantee loyalty, that when pressure reaches a certain point, proximity becomes dangerous, and people choose distance instead. The fall, he said, would not feel like defeat. It would feel like abandonment, and what followed would not be relief. Because this collapse was never about one man. It was about what happened to the system around him once the illusion cracked. Trust in institutions would evaporate. Courts would feel political. Elections would feel meaningless. Media would feel hostile. Truth itself would feel negotiable. And when truth disappears, fear fills the space it leaves behind. Irlmaier warned that this was the threshold. The moment when a nation stops believing that any structure can protect it. When disagreement hardens into suspicion. When silence becomes safer than speech. When families fracture not because of events, but because of interpretations of events. He did not describe panic. He described tension. A long, suffocating build-up. A sense that something irreversible had already begun, even though no official announcement had been made. Like standing on solid ground that suddenly feels hollow beneath your feet. And this, he said, was only the beginning. What followed the first fracture was not chaos, but normalization. That was the part Alois Irlmaier emphasized most carefully. In his vision, nothing collapsed all at once. The streets did not immediately burn. The government did not instantly fail. Instead, life continued just, slightly distorted, enough to be unsettling, but not enough to stop the routine. People still woke up, checked their phones, went to work. But something fundamental had shifted. Conversations grew shorter. Listening became rare. Every event, no matter how small, was filtered through suspicion. Facts were no longer evaluated. They were chosen. Truth stopped being something discovered and became something defended. Irlmaier described this phase as a quiet civil fracture. Not a war with weapons, but a war of perception. A country arguing with itself endlessly, loudly, without resolution. Families stopped speaking over dinner tables. Friends learned which topics to avoid. Silence became a survival strategy. And the more people withdrew, the more the division deepened. He warned that this inward collapse always comes before an outward one. Societies, he believed, do not fall because they are attacked. They fall because they forget how to agree on what is real. In the vision, this confusion created a vacuum. And vacuums do not remain empty for long. The figure at the center of the storm did not disappear after the first fall. That was one of the most misunderstood parts of the prophecy. Many assumed the story ended with defeat. Irlmaier insisted it did not. Instead, he spoke of a pause, a breath, a deceptive calm that made people believe the worst had passed. He described a second rise, not a triumphant return in the traditional sense, not tanks in the streets or crowds storming buildings. The return was quieter, more subtle, but emotionally stronger. The voice grew louder, the conviction sharpened. Supporters, wounded by what they believed was injustice, hardened their loyalty. Opponents, exhausted but vigilant, braced for conflict. This second rise, Irlmaier said, was the most dangerous phase of all, not because it restored power, but because it exposed weakness. The system, already strained, began to resist itself. Institutions that once moved slowly now reacted abruptly. Legal pressure intensified. Information leaked in fragments. Narratives shifted daily. Every statement became a weapon. Every silence became suspicious. The country no longer moved forward, oscillated. Those who studied Irlmaier's visions later would associate this phase with Donald Trump not as a politician, but as a symbol, a lightning rod, a focal point that concentrated every unresolved tension into a single figure. He represented defiance to some, disorder to others, but to the prophecy, he represented something else entirely. The moment when a society projects all of its internal conflict onto one man. And that projection came at a cost. Irlmaier described betrayal not as a dramatic act, but as a process. Advisors who once spoke daily became distant. Allies calculated risk instead of loyalty. Trusted figures disappeared quietly, not because they hated the man, but because proximity had become dangerous. The knife, he said, does not come from the front. It comes from the side. What made this betrayal devastating was timing. It arrived just as hope began to return, just as supporters believed the storm had been survived, just as the illusion of recovery settled in. That was when files were turned over, when silence replaced defense, when doors closed without explanation. The fall, when it came, was not explosive, it was humiliating. Irlmaier emphasized humiliation more than punishment. The leader did not simply lose power, he lost protection. He stood surrounded by noise, yet completely alone. Every accusation surfaced at once. Every failure replayed. The system did not pause to ask whether it was fair. It moved forward because momentum demanded it, and the crowd watched, not with grief, not with unity, but with fascination. The fall became content, debated, mocked, monetized. Dignity evaporated. And in that moment, something deeper broke not, just in the man at the center, but in the nation watching it happen. Because once people see power abandoned, they stop believing in permanence. Trust in courts felt selective. Trust in elections felt conditional. Trust in media felt hostile. Truth itself fractured into versions. Fear replaced confidence. And fear, left unchecked, turns inward. Irlmaier warned that this was the point of no return. Not because systems collapsed, but because belief in systems did. When people stop trusting structure, they stop restraining themselves. Words sharpen, accusations escalate. Every disagreement feels existential. The country entered what he described as an invisible war. No borders, no uniforms, just information used as ammunition. Lies repeated until they felt true. Truth labeled dangerous. Voices erased quietly. Platforms deciding reality. A war that weakens a nation faster than bombs ever could. He saw streets filling again, not only in cities known for unrest, but in places that had never known it before. Flags burning, symbols losing meaning, neighbors turning into strangers. A country no longer recognizing itself in the mirror. And still, From the outside, everything looked functional. This was the illusion that made the collapse so complete. Markets still moved, governments still spoke, life continued. But underneath, the foundations had cracked, the pressure built, and the prophecy moved closer to its darkest turn. Because according to Irlmaier, when confusion reaches its peak, something appears not to warn, but to accelerate. And by the time people look up, it is already too late to stop what comes next. The visions did not describe a sudden turn. They described a narrowing. A world that felt as if it was slowly being guided down a corridor with fewer exits, fewer options, fewer places to stand without choosing a side. Alois Irlmaier warned that when societies reach this stage, they stop noticing how constrained they have become because the narrowing feels familiar. By the time the second rise unfolded, the nation was already exhausted. Not physically, but mentally. Years of argument had dulled sensitivity. Scandals no longer shocked. Accusations blended together. The emotional bandwidth of the public was depleted, and that depletion created a dangerous kind of calm. People stopped reacting, not because things improved, but because outrage no longer produced change. This was the environment in which the return occurred, not as a restoration of order, but as a sharpening of tone. The voice at the center grew more defiant, more certain, more convinced that it had been chosen to finish what was interrupted. Supporters interpreted this as strength. Opponents interpreted it as threat. But the prophecy was uninterested in either interpretation. What mattered was what happened behind the noise. Irlmaier described a system that had quietly decided it could no longer afford ambiguity. Legal mechanisms moved faster. Procedural norms bent. Old rules were rediscovered, reinterpreted, repurposed, not necessarily unjustly, but relentlessly. The pressure was not theatrical. It was administrative, cold, precise, and because it was procedural, it felt unavoidable. At the same time, loyalty continued to thin. The betrayal he saw did not resemble treason. It resembled self-preservation. People who once defended loudly learned the value of silence. Statements became carefully worded. Support was expressed privately, if at all. Public alignment became rare. Even neutrality carried risk. The prophecy emphasized how isolating this phase would feel. The leader did not lose his audience, but he lost his circle. Advisors stopped volunteering counsel. Allies avoided proximity. Doors that once opened with familiarity now required appointments, conditions, distance. Power remained visible, but its infrastructure dissolved. And this dissolution happened gradually enough that few recognized it until it was complete. Irlmaier described the moment of realization as devastating, not because of consequences, but because of clarity. The sudden understanding that applause cannot stop momentum, that devotion cannot override procedure, that when systems turn inward to protect themselves, individuals become expendable. The collapse, when it arrived, was not dramatic in the way history books prefer. There were no final speeches that changed the outcome. No counterattack that reversed direction. The narrative escaped control. Files surfaced, accusations layered, silence hardened, and the world watched not as participants, but as spectators. This was one of the most unsettling elements of the vision. The fall did not inspire mourning. It inspired consumption. Headlines multiplied. Opinions polarized. Every detail became content. People chose sides, not based on truth, but emotional alignment. Justice became secondary to entertainment. Irlmaier warned that humiliation would be the defining characteristic of this phase. Not humiliation inflicted by enemies, but humiliation amplified by indifference. the sense of being exposed to everyone at once, without protection, without loyalty, without refuge. And this humiliation did not end with one man. It rippled outward. Trust collapsed faster than institutions. People stopped believing that fairness existed at all. Courts felt selective. Media felt weaponized. Elections felt symbolic rather than decisive. Every outcome felt predetermined, regardless of evidence. And when belief disappears, restraint follows. The nation entered what Irlmaier called its most dangerous internal condition. Not open war, but moral exhaustion. A state where people no longer argue to persuade, but to survive. Where silence feels safer than honesty. Where relationships fracture not because of events, but because of interpretations of events. He described families divided permanently, not over policy, but over reality itself. Friends choosing distance rather than risk. Communities losing shared language. A society unable to resolve conflict because it could no longer agree on the terms of disagreement. This internal collapse, he believed, was irreversible once it reached a certain depth. Not because systems failed, but because conscience weakened. When fear replaces trust, every action becomes defensive. Every word becomes a weapon. Every silence becomes suspect. And in this environment, where confusion peaked, loyalty evaporated, and belief fractured, Irlmaier saw something appear that did not belong to politics at all. He described people looking upward, not in wonder, not in hope, but in unease, lights, movements, colors that did not inspire awe, but discomfort, phenomena that forced attention without offering explanation. Scientists spoke, authorities reassured, but reassurance failed because trust was already gone. The sign, whatever its nature, mattered less than its timing. It appeared at the moment of maximum confusion, and according to the vision, it did not cause panic. It confirmed it. By the time the signs appeared, fear no longer announced itself. It had become background noise. Alois Irlmaier did not describe crowds screaming or mass hysteria. He described something far more unsettling. Recognition, a collective sense that whatever people were seeing above them did not belong to reassurance, explanation, or progress. The lights were not beautiful. The movements were not inspiring. They did not feel like discovery. They felt like confirmation. In the vision, people stopped what they were doing and looked up, not because they were curious, but because something inside them already knew that the timing was wrong. Governments spoke, scientists explained, media analyzed, but explanations bounced off a population that no longer trusted language. Whatever appeared in the sky did not frighten people on its own. It frightened them because it arrived when trust was already gone. Irlmaier was careful here. He never defined the sign. He did not say whether it was natural or artificial, celestial or technological. That ambiguity was intentional. What mattered was not what it was, but what it did. It accelerated everything. After the sign, he said, events began to move faster. Not violently, inevitably. Collapses stacked on top of one another. Conflicts overlapped. Silence replaced debate. Decisions were made without explanation, and the sense of standing on unstable ground became impossible to ignore. This was when the invisible war reached its peak. Information no longer informed. It overwhelmed. Words lost weight. Repetition replaced truth. Lies did not need to be convincing. They only needed to be constant. People heard what was false and accepted it as real, while truth itself became suspicious, dangerous, divisive. Voices disappeared quietly. Platforms decided reality. Disagreement was reclassified as hostility, and the more people tried to speak, the less anything meant. Irlmaier warned that this kind of war does not destroy buildings, it destroys orientation. People lose the ability to tell where they stand. And then, without warning, the noise stopped. The silence he described was unnatural, sudden, as if the world itself had taken a breath and refused to exhale. The constant arguing faded. The endless commentary vanished. Streets felt heavy. Air felt wrong. And then came the darkness. He was explicit about what it was not. It was not night, not weather, not eclipse. It was a darkness that behaved differently, thick, pressing, unresponsive to artificial light. Electricity failed. Technology went silent. Communication vanished. Time itself became uncertain. People did not know how long it lasted. Hours felt like days. Days felt indistinguishable. Without screens, without signals, without constant noise, humanity was forced into stillness. And stillness, Irlmaier warned, is terrifying to a world addicted to distraction. He spoke of fear spreading not through violence, but through uncertainty. The terror was not what people saw, but what they could no longer see. No information, no reassurance, no authority capable of explanation. Governments did not collapse dramatically. They simply became irrelevant. In this darkness, he warned, panic was the real danger. People would be tempted to run, to search, to force answers. He cautioned against it, not because of punishment, but because fear multiplies itself when acted upon without clarity. This was the moment when human systems completely failed. No courts, no media, no leaders, no narratives, just people alone with their thoughts, their regrets, their faith if they had any left. The darkness did not create collapse, it revealed it. Everything that had already been unstable was exposed by the absence of noise. Irlmaier believed that this was the true judgment, not legal, not political, but existential. Humanity confronted with the realization that control was always an illusion, that technology, power, and ambition had only masked fragility, not eliminated it. When the darkness lifted, the world did not erupt into celebration. It emerged exhausted. He did not see cities in ruins. Buildings still stood. Roads remained. Infrastructure returned slowly, but something essential was gone. The confidence that humans were in charge. The belief that systems would always function. The arrogance that had defined progress for generations. People walked more slowly, spoke less, listened more. Conversations changed. The obsession with being right faded, replaced by a hunger to understand. The desire to dominate weakened, replaced by the need to belong again. This phase was not peaceful at first. It was empty. A strange quiet that felt unfamiliar after years of constant noise. People mourned what was lost: leaders, certainty, identity, trust. But in that mourning, something deeper began to form: humility. Irlmaier believed this shift was the only reason humanity survived what came before. Without collapse, there was no awakening. Without humiliation, no repentance. Without darkness, no clarity. The suffering was not celebrated, but it was explained. Everything that broke did so because it was never stable to begin with. And it was in this fragile silence that something unexpected appeared. Not chaos, presence. He described the emergence of a different kind of leadership, not through campaigns, elections, or force. A man with white hair, calm eyes, and no hunger for power. Someone who did not arrive during the storm, but after it, when fear no longer worked, when people were too tired to be manipulated. This figure did not command. He did not persuade. He did not promise restoration. People followed him because being near him felt steady. His authority came not from dominance, but from peace. Some interpreted this as a literal leader yet to come. Others believed it symbolized a broader awakening, return to wisdom over ambition, conscience over control. Irlmaier himself did not insist on one interpretation. What mattered was why the figure appeared. He appeared because the world had finally learned. Not everyone would accept this change. Some would cling to the old structures, the old resentments, the idols that had failed them, but others would let go. Families would rebuild not around ideology, but around values. Communities would rediscover responsibility. Faith would return quietly, not as a weapon, but as an anchor. The most important transformation, he said, would not be visible. It would happen inside individuals. When the world began to move again, it did so without urgency. There was no rush to rebuild narratives, no hunger to reclaim certainty. Alois Irlmaier did not see celebration after the darkness. He saw hesitation, humanity stepping forward carefully, as if unsure whether the ground beneath it could still be trusted. The silence lingered longer than expected. Not an absence of sound, but an absence of insistence. People no longer demanded answers immediately. They no longer expected leaders to explain everything. The old reflex to look upward for authority, downward for enemies, outward for blame had weakened. What replaced it was quieter. People spoke less, but listened more closely. Arguments lost their heat. Not because everyone suddenly agreed, but because agreement no longer felt as important as understanding. The need to be right had been exhausted. The need to belong had returned. Irlmaier described this phase as unfamiliar even to those living through it. Progress slowed, ambition softened. The obsession with control faded, replaced by a cautious respect for limits. Humanity had discovered, too late and too painfully, that power without humility collapses under its own weight. Institutions still existed, but they no longer inspired blind faith. Systems still functioned, but they were no longer worshipped. People had learned what it felt like to lose everything external at once. And having survived that, they were less eager to surrender themselves again. This was not a perfect world. Wounds remained. Memories lingered. Some clung to resentment, unable to release what had been lost. But others allowed something new to grow in the space where certainty had once lived. Families reconnected slowly. Communities rebuilt around shared responsibility rather than shared outrage. Faith returned not as doctrine, but as refuge. Not loud, not triumphant, quiet, necessary. Irlmaier believed this was the true turning point. Not the fall of a leader, not the failure of systems, not even the darkness itself. The turning point was the moment humanity stopped believing it could save itself through dominance alone. The future, as he saw it, did not depend on prophecy being fulfilled. It depended on memory, whether people remembered what collapse felt like, and whether they chose humility before arrogance returned. As the noise of the old world faded, something gentler took its place. Not answers, not certainty, but awareness. And in that awareness, the story did not end.